Hey everybody, Dan Kent here. This week I want to take a look at Thomas Jay Oord's book, Pluriform Love, an open and relational theology of well-being. And so he starts off the book in chapter 1 right away, looking at kind of these classic understandings of God, where God is primarily sovereign. And so power and control are these important dimensions of God. And God's love ends up sort of getting swallowed up under those kind of more domineering qualities. And he looks at, when you look at love itself, when you say God is love, the Greek word there that's used is agape. And so Thomas wants to know, well, what exactly is agape? So he looks at a theologian in the 20th century named Anders Nygren. I think I'm pronouncing that right, who sort of did a lot of work on what is agape, and but he does so from this classic perspective that sort of kind of prioritizes God's sovereignty and control and power, and he understands agape underneath that. And so to Nygren, he has this theocentric kind of view of agape, where agape is really something that God does, and God does only. Humans don't really do it. It looks like we do it, but that's just God expressing agape through us. Humans in this whole equation are not much more than like tubes or these empty vessels that God animates with God's own love. To quote Nygren, he says that all choice on man's part is excluded. In other words, humans have no say-so in this. Humans don't choose any of this. They just are sort of animated by it, but they're not really a key part of this. So Thomas then in his book here does a great job. He goes through kind of section by section through the Bible and just shows how all of these places where hesed or agape are used, it doesn't really work with what Anders Nygren is saying. Instead, what Thomas says is that we need to develop a new kind of better understanding of agape and what does it mean to love in this way. And so I appreciate he right away in chapter 2, Thomas comes right out and says, this is my kind of working definition of what it means to have agape love. And so he says that to love in this way is to act intentionally in relational response to God and others, to promote overall well-being. What makes it divine, what makes it godly, Thomas says is sort of, it becomes sort of like this in spite of love. What makes it really unique is that agape is this in spite of love. So even if there's negativity involved, or even if it might cause you harm, you still have this love for others. And so as it pertains to God, what Thomas says is that God is essentially this agape. And so in other words, God is always having this sort of in spite of love. And because God is essentially this, God cannot not love in this way. And that brings me to this important point. Thomas, the subtitle is An Open and Relational Theology of Well-Being. And what Thomas means by an open and relational theology, he's including kind of like these concepts about God that would include both process theism and open theism and some various theologies in between. And basically what they all have in common, as opposed to classic views of God, this kind of open and relational view says that God is primarily love. Love plays a crucial role. And so human say-so and human freedom also play an important role. And in order for all of that to be authentic, there has to be some sense in which things are not yet determined. There's still possibility that God doesn't micromanage the future, but rather God participates in creation and experiences the unfolding of the future with people. But process theism and open theism are a little bit different in a couple of ways, and you really start to see Thomas's process theism sort of emerge as he talks about some things, like, for instance, he talks about essential kenosis. Kenosis is this kind of self-emptying of God, and we see this in Philippians 2, where we're told that God emptied himself of his divine rights to become Jesus. And this kenosis is sort of like this self-giving, this self-emptying with the purpose of kind of building others up or empowering others or for doing good to the world. And what Thomas says is that God is essentially kenotic. And this is something that's essential, not deliberative. In other words, God doesn't think, I wonder if I should empty myself, or I wonder if I should serve others. I wonder if I should build others up. No, he just does it. It's not something that God deliberates on. He just essentially does it. In other words, because of this self-emptying, kind of subservient sort of nature that God has, God cannot control anyone or anything else. This is what Thomas refers to as the uncontrolling love of God. What do you say about this book? First of all, I guess what I would say is that Thomas, I mean, the guy has written over 20 books about love. And so if you are incorporating the concept of love and God's love and Christian love in your sermons or in your own writings, you would be a fool not to include Thomas's book in your research, because there is just a depth of contemplation that you sense as you're reading this book that it would be silly not to consider it. So I highly recommend it. I mean, the part where he does this biblical exploration of agape by itself is worth the cost of the book. So I do, even if you disagree with some of his process theology, which I do, I still think that this book is super valuable, and I think that you should consider it as part of your library. So I do have a couple criticisms about it that it's not even, I don't even like to say criticisms, because we just disagree about this and I'm not convinced yet. And even though I'm not convinced by Thomas's perspective on this, I'm still open to the fact that Thomas could be right, and I just am not seeing it yet. And some of these ideas are really deep and complex, and so these should be considered meditations, not arguments, not even theories. That just think of them as like meditations, and to just meditate on some of the things that Thomas talks about. So in my meditation of Thomas's ideas, this is sort of some of the problems. Oh, I'm shaking the whole world here. Some of the problems that I've had kind of really stem from his idea of essential kenosis, because if you take that this idea that God is essentially kenotic, that is, God cannot control people or anything, and you take this idea that God is essentially loving, that God loves by compulsion, it's not a choice, I feel like this understanding of God sort of sabotages this idea that God can be agape love. Because if you remember Thomas's definition, he says that this type of love is an intentional act. It's a choice-based act. But if all of this stuff is done compulsively and God has no control, then it can't really be intentional, and it can't really be choice-based. And really how it all comes down, I think, is in the same way that Anders Nygren said that all choice on man's part is excluded when you understand love in the context of this God who controls everything. Well, I can't help but to see that in Thomas's view, all choice on God's part is excluded, because when God can't control and when God must compulsively love, well, then it doesn't really seem like God has any say-so in the matter, in which case then this idea that God is having this intentional love, it doesn't seem possible. You can't be intentional if you don't have any say-so. So that's my primary hang-up with the theology. But all of that is really just sort of the window dressing on a lot of what Thomas says in his book about love, which I think is profound and brilliant. And I think that there's so much value here, even if you disagree with the nature of God as God participates in this agape love. So I do highly recommend it. Now, we're going to have Thomas Jay Oord on the Surprising God group tomorrow, Saturday, September 10th. And I'm going to ask him about these things directly, and I'm looking forward to his response to that. If you would like to be a part of that conversation, there's, I think, about 15 of us that are going to be in there. You can join us. Go to surprisinggod.com, and I will send you the link. Definitely pick up this book if you are a Christian, if you are a pastor or whatever. There's a lot of value in here. Highly recommend it.